Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today for this webinar about zoning as a tool for climate and affordability. Next slide, please. Here's a little overview about what we're going to be talking about today. We'll start with a few welcomes, do a little level setting, and then dive into things that local governments can do tangibly with their zoning codes for sustainability. We'll start with some broad brushstrokes and then move into specifics around solar and battery energy storage systems, or BESS, electric vehicles, and geothermal systems. Next, please. The first introduction I'll make to you will be on behalf of the Great Plains Institute, or GPI itself. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to accelerate the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. Now, I've put our vision and mission and values up here on the screen, but I really want us to spend our time today focused on the subject at hand. So if you're interested in learning more or talking about those, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation at any point. Next slide, please. But that leads to an important question of how would you get a hold of me? So let me give you some introductions to myself and the team. My name is Mackenzie Love, and I'm a senior program manager at the Great Plains Institute, and I led the project that this webinar is a part of. And today I'll be joined by two of my esteemed colleagues, Sydney Tursky, who's a program manager working in GPI's renewable energies team, and Rebecca Heisel, who's a program manager working in GPI's communities team. They are fantastic leaders in this cohort that we're going to be sharing takeaways from, and the contact information for each of them and myself is on the screen. So if you have any questions after today, please do reach out. Next, please. So onto the project of the day. We got started with this work by doing a nationwide survey of planners and sustainability staff with the goal of understanding what they needed help with and then aiming to fill any gaps that might exist. We received 235 responses from folks across the country with a wide variety of backgrounds in terms of the sectors they work in, their educational background, and level of work experience. And they unsurprisingly told us that some of the biggest barriers to doing climate work were a lack of funding and a lack of staff time or capacity. One new thing that we got from this survey, though, was that the type of resources they felt would help them best overcome some of those barriers were examples. They really wanted to know what is happening in the real world in peer communities, because that might give them a way to move climate goals along in their own communities. Next, please. Those same folks also told us what type of topics they'd be interested in getting support on. And when we considered that list of topics along with their desire for real world examples, we came up with 3 ways in which we hope to help people. The first was running a national cohort of communities with participants that are interested in exploring energy affordability through zoning. And that's what we're going to be sharing some takeaways from with you today. We also worked with a group of advisory panel, rather, from across the country to create 2 playbooks that would aim to identify levers of actions that local governments can use to either advance or protect their climate goals when they're considering things like autonomous vehicles or data centers, some of the most pressing topics today. We'll be having a webinar on each of those as well, during which we will share access to those new playbooks right as they come off the presses. So we're excited about those and hope that you'll consider joining us at the dates on your screen. We will have links later in today's presentation and in the chat so that you can sign up. Next, please. So now we'll move into going over the cohort itself. And we will talk a little bit about the structure of what we did on the next slide. So we can go ahead and move there. Our cohort was formed with 3 key pieces. The first is these group meetings in which all the participants got together and learned about a variety of topics that I'll go over in just a moment. The idea was that they could receive some free technical assistance and access to best practices that our team has gathered by working across the country in a variety of settings and start to build some networks amongst themselves so they can reach out for those peer connections and examples from one another. We supplemented that with office hours where participants could come to GPI staff and ask context-specific questions about their work on zoning, climate, and affordability. And then we also offered some of the participants a review of their zoning code by our staff, which looked into all of the topics that cohort explored that are listed in the center of your screen there. Those included electric vehicles, solar and battery energy storage systems or BESS, geothermal, and then some general sustainability recommendations. 26 different local governments took part in this cohort, and they came from 7 different states. So we had a lot of different environments that we were able to share resources across. And some of those participants were regional organizations, which also took learnings from the cohort and brought them to all of their members, spreading some of this information just a little bit further. And that's the kind of networks that GPI typically aims to build in these initiatives. Next, please. So now we'll go into what we actually talked about with those cohorts. And on the next slide, the first thing we'll go over is some kind of broad brushstrokes about how you can do sustainability initiatives by using your zoning ordinance as a tool. Next, please. You might have gathered from this presentation, we're going to be sharing a lot of information today, and some of it is pretty detail oriented. Don't worry, we're recording this. We'll be posting it on our YouTube page, and we're sharing all of our contact information if you have any questions. But I know that it might be a little overwhelming. So I want to tell you right up front, if you can only remember one thing from today, I hope that it is this. Communities are an essential part of climate solutions always, and regardless of if you have codified climate commitments. Now, this is important and true not only for your municipal operations, but also for private development. And that's really where the value of your zoning ordinance comes in, because zoning can be used to regulate developments of various types. Now, that's important for a variety of reasons, but I'm going to highlight 2. The first is that all development is infrastructure. When I think of the word infrastructure, maybe the same is true for you. I often think of something like a bridge, something big that's going to stay for a long time. But I invite you to consider that buildings and other projects will also be part of your community fabric for a long time. And indeed, they might change owners, maybe even uses over their lifespan. And for that reason, the standards that are used for their construction and their siting are just as important to your long-term climate goals. The next reason is that all development is local. Even if a project is part of a statewide initiative, a federal endeavor, or even a large-scale private project, it happens in a local environment and it has local impacts. Additionally, as a local government, those folks have the greatest influence on how projects, even at a larger scale, are integrated into existing community systems, and thus how they will actually be used by the people in that area. So localities are always an important partner in bringing along climate through those various level of developments. Now, if that intrinsic value of local governments to climate work wasn't an exciting enough takeaway for one slide, I actually have one more for you right now, which is that local governments already have all of the tools you need to do this. You already have things that exist to help in climate responsive developments, even if you don't have climate goals. Your zoning ordinance is a great example of this. It's flexible and it can be used in many ways to support both those municipal operations and the private sector development. And we'll go into more specifics later, but a couple of special features I'll bring up around zoning are that you can use it to develop partnerships with entities that may not have historically been motivated by those same climate goals. You can do this by framing your zoning work around things like cost savings, which benefits everything and might help you develop some deeper partnerships through that framing. For example, encouraging buildings to be more efficient can save money for its occupants or users in the short term, potentially for your entire municipality in terms of avoiding retrofits later. And encouraging dense development through your zoning ordinance can help you minimize the cost for roads and getting utilities out to new, say, residences. So that can help. Emphasizing those cost savings can allow you to bring along those climate goals and deepen relationships with stakeholders who might have different perspectives. You can also use framing through your zoning to bring along community members that might be really focused on short-term and tangible things by highlighting co-benefits of your climate work. You can talk about things like improving air quality for folks' kids, That's usually a pretty good motivator and helps you build really strong coalition of support for your climate work. Next slide, please. Zoning, of course, isn't the only tool that can be used in this way. It's part of a larger planning toolbox, if you will, that includes things like your comprehensive plans and your climate plans, which help you identify goals and really track emission sectors and set forth a vision. There's also development regulations, which help you encourage certain types of land uses and patterns and make the best use of your local resources. For example, your solar and solar resources where they are available and putting land uses next to one another that harmonize together. You also have this permitting and development review process as a local government. And GPI, along with our national partners, has seen this be a potential, one of the areas of most greatest sources of delay, if you will, in climate projects. So getting that permitting process streamlined and making sure that it's clear right away to developers what they need to do and what your goals are can make it easier for them to engage with you on that climate work and to get projects in the ground. The final toolkit piece I'll bring up here is that public sector investments and local programs can really help remove any barriers that might exist in the private sector and just make that a little bit easier to get those climate related projects underway. Next slide, please. And I'll talk a little bit about, we talked about this toolbox that you have available with zoning being a key, one of the stars. So let's talk about how you can actually use it. Here are some principles of having climate forward zoning. I'll go through them in somewhat high level because again, we're going to go in depth later. So the first one here is to create development by right opportunities for low and no carbon land uses. This means that you're going to allow these things to happen without needing review and approval by something like a planning commission or another board that may have long lead times. An example of this would be allowing EV chargers by right in all zones. The next principle is to explicitly recognize and permit clean energy and low carbon land uses. This is important again because you do not want developers or community members to be reading your zoning code and trying to guess what is allowed and what isn't. That leads to a lot of different interpretations, slows down the process, and might determine the direction of certain development efforts. So you want to be really clear. Hey, we like solar for residences, for example. Another principle is to incorporate nature-based solutions and encourage those. Could be things like encouraging tree canopies as a mechanism for managing heat, especially in urban settings. Another principle is to design for multimodal transportation systems and really encourage density and connectivity between land uses. This is particularly important because transportation sector is the source of greatest emissions at the national level and often at the local level as well. But it's really tricky to move those patterns because the decisions are often made at kind of the household or individual level. So this is where you'll remember earlier I said all development is local because it's a locality that has the most strong connections to the people. You can use those in terms of transportation by encouraging land uses to be adjacent to one another and supporting those individual and households in making decisions that reduce their emissions by minimizing the distance that they have to travel or offering them alternative modes to single occupancy vehicles. Finally, I'll say you should encourage co-benefits of your climate work. Again, this could be health impacts or perhaps cost savings. And you can also think about this as a way to bring along additional stakeholder groups and deepen support for your projects. All right, next slide, please. Talk a little bit about, okay, now you've started thinking of your community as a partner in development. You're ready to use your zoning and perhaps the other tools in your planning toolkit that already exist. And this might actually create more opportunities for you to make an even bigger impact. You could consider doing this through incentives or financial partnerships. You might also consider exploring if community benefits agreements are something that you can do in your context to encourage more climate work than might be possible through your zoning, etc. Economic development activities can also incorporate climate objectives into them. You might want to think about cost savings as one economic development incentive, but another thing to consider is ecotourism. Finally, I will say that thinking in this way proactively about climate through your various tools, there may be some restrictions in your specific context. For example, some local governments can adopt building codes or energy codes, and some states don't allow local governments to do that. So it's important to check that out before you start making progress. You may want to explore the difference between if you're in a home rule or a Dillon rule state, for example. But that being said, I do want to have you recall the one thing I hope you remember from today, which is that regardless of any restrictions or limitations that you may find about adopting these kinds of codes, you still have ways as a local government to influence climate development, and you're always a critical partner. And there are tools that do exist right now, especially your zoning, that can be used to make that impact real. So on the next slide, I'll just conclude by saying those were some very broad brushstrokes on how zoning can be used as a climate tool. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sydney, to take you into a bit more specificity around solar battery energy storage systems and battery energy storage systems. Thanks, Sydney.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Hi, everybody. I realized as Mackenzie was talking that I didn't put this in the slides, but it feels like maybe we should talk about why solar and battery energy storage would be related to affordability and climate. I think for most of you, the climate connection is quite clear. We know that solar produces no greenhouse gas emissions compared to other forms of energy like burning fossil fuels. And as far as affordability, more energy on the grid is always good right now. We're certainly headed to a place of bigger loads and needing more out there. And the more energy that can be locally produced and specifically directed for particularly low income residents could be a huge asset in reducing energy costs. So next slide. Now that we got that out of the way, I feel like you all knew it, but wanted to just go over it really quick. Um, One thing that we always say here at GPI is that every community is a host community in the clean energy future. So, going back many decades when all of our energy came from like coal plants, those would have been centered in certain communities, and other communities didn't really have to touch energy infrastructure except for those distribution lines bringing the energy in. That's changing. Now that we are hopefully transitioning more and more to renewable sources like solar, wind, geothermal, etc. Many of those energy sources are local. They can be right next door to provide energy for specific buildings in your community. And every community in the country has solar. So renewable energy, and many have wind. So renewable energy can be an economically valuable local resource in every community. And so even if clean energy, maybe you haven't been approached about a specific project yet, trust that it probably will happen. And this is something to think about and be prepared for in advance of a developer trying to develop a specific project. Next slide. Our goal is that ordinances would enable reasonable development that captures benefits, but also minimizes risk. And so what that means as far as solar ready zoning, I'm going to talk about solar first here, is explicitly recognizing what solar is, what it can look like in your community, create by right installation opportunities, set clear standards that are balancing the solar resources and development with the other things your community has going on, and also thinking about co-benefits. So, what could a solar project bring in addition to just producing solar energy? That might be ecosystem benefits, it might be economic benefits. There are many ways to think about it. Overall, the goal here is to be clear, easy to understand, predictable, so that people know what it looks like to try to develop a solar project in your community, and that whatever those guidelines are, that they align with both any climate goals you have and also any other land uses or issues or concerns or anything else happening in your community. Next slide. Sorry, folks, we have a slight lag. Here we go. So when we think about solar, there's typically kind of three different categories. We have accessory use solar, which is going to be rooftop solar on a house, is an example, or maybe a small ground mount system that's in a backyard or something like that. Those are going to be significantly less than 1 megawatt of solar. Then we have community scale solar, which is typically 1 to 5 megawatts. In some cases, it can go up to 10 megawatts. Um, and the goal with community scale and accessory use solar, since they are smaller, is that these would, in at least some cases, be permitted by right. And I will go into more details on that in a moment. And then we have large scale solar, which is larger than 10 megawatts. So these are going to be the giant systems maybe you see while you're driving down the highway. They are could be up to 50, 100 megawatts, or perhaps even more than that. And these we would typically expect to be permitted through a conditional use permit because they are so large and often have a lot of considerations on top of what you would just see for an accessory use solar installation. Next slide. So for accessory and community scale solar, so that's basically anything under 10 megawatts, as I said before, we would also call that distributed scale solar. Kind of different terms meaning the same thing there. And I won't go over all of these specific zoning best practices. We'll share the slides after. But in general, our goal is that small rooftop and ground mounted systems would be a by right accessory use in all major zoning districts, and that it would not, like for instance, rooftop solar would not be treated differently than any other sort of accessory use on a home. So we would want it exempted from screening requirements for a roof or height restrictions, similar to perhaps an HVAC system. Next slide. And I actually know the next one is about large scale solar, so I'll start talking about it. Uh, Here we would want to define large scale solar as a unique land use when zoning for that, so it's not an industrial land use. You want to include storage, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And when we're distinguishing between different types of solar in zoning, we want to think about the size by acreage of the project, not even though I've been distinguishing these types by megawatt, it actually makes more sense in your zoning code to think about size in by area. Uh, and there's a few more things here. Consider co-benefits, and in general, you want to treat large-scale solar as you would other similar land uses. So, for instance, solar should not have extra screening requirements that perhaps an industrial use does not have. Should be treated the same. We don't want to be extra mean to solar just because. Next slide. So if you have any more questions about solar zoning best practices particularly, I feel free to reach out to us, but also we just wanted to plug the Energy Ready program, which provides lots of planning and zoning assistance to local governments around solar, EV charging, and now wind. So just wanted to plug that, but again, feel free to reach out to us. Rebecca, if you'll skip 2 slides, that would be great. Next, I'm going to talk about battery energy storage systems. So we call that BESS for short. Next slide, Rebecca. And in general, these are going to be, as you might imagine, a large battery that is sited often next to solar or perhaps a building that has solar on the roof or something like that. I have a definition here of what an energy storage system is. It's commercially available technology that is capable of absorbing energy and storing it for a period of time for use at a later time. There's many different types of energy storage systems, many different types of batteries, but in general, we're just thinking of it in the way you might have a battery in your remote control. You've got a bunch of energy in there and you're saving it for later. Next slide. So sometimes battery energy storage systems make the news for not great reasons. You might have heard of battery fires or things like that. And I think that can get people a little bit nervous. But BESS is not a fundamentally new land use. There are many existing energy storage facilities in communities that have been there for a very long time. An example would be a grain elevator. So you're storing energy commodities for later use. Are there differences between BESS and a grain elevator? Yes, but it maybe doesn't deserve quite all the hullabaloo that it has gotten thus far. Next slide. So something I think is important to note is that typically if you had a standalone battery system, Um, they use modular containers, kind of looks like a shipping container. They're in rows on concrete pads. They don't require very much maintenance. There's not going to be a lot of traffic coming in and out of a BESS installation. They're not very obtrusive visually. You probably wouldn't really notice it as different from other buildings in an area. And they typically don't rely on water for cooling. They're air cooled. Next slide. I'm gonna skip past this, Rebecca. Next slide. This is just saying the benefits of BESS, which is that it's reducing the need for perhaps fossil fuel energy during peak times, allows you to save clean energy for later, and have increased energy reliability. Next slide, Rebecca. As far as planning considerations, um, there's a few different ways for energy storage to be used. You might have residential, so someone might have a battery in their house in case the power goes out, or there might be one on a commercial building to provide backup power. There's also grid scale batteries. That's kind of what you'd see with these standalone batteries that are serving a lot of different functions to help utility operations run more smoothly. And then there's also power production. So at a large scale solar or perhaps wind site, batteries might be attached. Next slide. So, in general, our best practices for addressing battery energy storage systems in ordinances are going to be include those definitions. What do we mean when we talk about BESS? What are the different sizes? Small BESS should really not be subject to zoning. So, if someone's trying to put a battery on their house, just in case there's a power outage, really should not be subject to zoning at all. Um, and in general, permit BESS as accessory uses where it might be needed. If it's a larger system, think about that. Um, Require compliance with appropriate fire and safety codes, including training for first responders. Um, though battery energy storage systems maybe get a little bit more fear than needed. They do have some special considerations as far as if there is a fire, there's a certain way to put that out that often doesn't involve water or the way you might put out a house fire. So make sure your first responders are trained and require a decommissioning plan. And I think for time, I don't even remember if I have any more slides, but we'll just skip that one and I'll pass it on back to you, Rebecca.
And apologies for the lag. I'm actually, oh, well, and it's already up. We're switching who's sharing screen to try and solve for that problem on the fly. And hopefully my audio is coming through clear enough for you. but apologies if it's a little crackled. So I'll be covering electric vehicles and how we can incorporate EVs and charging structure into our zoning ordinance. And if we move to the next slide, um, one of the first things that we recommend when thinking about adding EVs and charging structure into your zoning ordinance is to identify what restrictions may currently exist in your zoning ordinance that would restrict EV deployment, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in your community. And we hope that today, by kind of like understanding these best practices, and the goal of the cohort was that by understanding the best practices that are talked about all technologies, we can be encourage deployment of the technologies within our communities, as well as streamlining the permitting processes. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the first best practice, which is to define terminology related to EVs and charging infrastructure within your zoning code. And I think sometimes this seems obvious and is something that we should do across all of the technologies that were talked about in this cohort and that we're discussing today. But it's really important to establish clear and shared terminology related to EVs and charging infrastructure to reduce confusion for plan reviewers as well as charger owners and developers, and helps prevent inconsistent interpretations across your municipal departments. So, when we're thinking about clear definitions, it also can help improve transparency and predictability within our permitting processes, which then in turn reduces delays and supports faster and more coordinated charger deployment. So for instance, on this slide and in future slides, I have the abbreviation EVSE, and this stands for, if you're not aware, electric vehicle supply equipment, or kind of in other terms, just kind of charging infrastructure and equipment in general. So when we do create these definitions, keeping them broad and avoiding restricting power levels and types of charging can help future-proof our ordinances as the technology continues to evolve and change. As we move on to the next slide, the next best practice is related to permitting EV charging as an accessory use to parking lots by right. So some of the communities that we work with, they don't have this best practice written into their zoning code, but they do interpret their code that way, which is a good first step, and we like to see it, but we do recommend that it is written out explicitly, because having it written explicitly in your code as an allowable accessory use by right still makes it subject to clearly stated performance-based standards, and makes it so that the projects can be reviewed administratively. So when we take this approach and have it written out clearly, it avoids a discretionary review process, which adds time, cost, and uncertainty to projects, which nobody likes to see. But it still allows you as a municipality to apply clear requirements related to safety siting and things like design compatibility. All right, so as we move on to the next slide, the next recommendation is that when they are clearly a primary use, we should allow EV chargers as an approved use of a site with streamlined permitting and zoning review. So charging stations, infrastructure should not be defined as an existing use like parking or a fueling station or other related uses, because charging stations they don't have the same sort of environmental concerns as the other uses that I mentioned, but especially those fueling stations. So when we define EV charging as its own category, communities can create tailored regulations that address those unique characteristics and the needs of the charging stations. So, for that same reason, charging stations as a primary use should be available in all commercial and industrial zoning districts to promote integration of charging infrastructure into areas where there's high traffic and extended dwell times. Additionally, we might want to consider creating minor site plan reviews for these uses to, establish a streamlined pathway for charging infrastructure that has clearly defined permitting requirements that is alternative to the typical more rigorous site plan review process. All right, so if we go on to the next slide, one of the other best practices that we covered in the cohort was about adopting charging infrastructure and charging station accessibility standards that are aligned with national standards. And so without clear accessibility standards, EV charging stations uh, that are built can be built in ways that are difficult or impossible for people with disabilities to use. And that can lead to a lot of issues such as complaints or needs for retrofits, which can be expensive, or just in general missed opportunities to be best serving our community members. Um, so we want to make sure that we're establishing those guidelines, and we can also make sure that developers within our zoning ordinance, we can write in kind of encouragement or requirements that say that EV charging stations um, we need a certain number of accessible charging statements required based on the percentage or ratio of other charging infrastructure that's going in. So we have lots of guidelines and resources that we can share that I'll talk about later related to that. But if we go on to the next slide, when we're thinking about drafting a EV zoning ordinance, we also want to be sure that we're defining and illustrating design and safety measures. So we should be mindful to avoid overly prescriptive parking design standards to account for variations in site conditions and layouts, and include language that authorizes um, reviews and approvals of alternative design options if strict compliance isn't possible. So, one way that we can do this is having performance-based requirements, and performance-based requirements might include things like provisions of shade and considerations for pedestrian safety and landscaping. All right, so if we go on to the next slide, I believe this is my second to last recommendation that we discussed in the cohort. And this one is related to minimum parking standards. I do want to preface this with not every community has minimum parking standards. So the first step is to determine if your community has them or not. And if you do have them, uh, then this guidance would be applicable to you. So we would say that if you have minimum parking standards, you should allow EV charging parking stalls to count towards minimum parking standards, when applicable, of course, to encourage charging infrastructure deployment within your community. We can also require that ADA parking spots count as two or more parking spots since they are larger than a typical parking stall. And that also can encourage developers to include accessible charging spaces within their plan. Similarly, some communities even elect to count charging stations as two or more parking spots, whether they are accessible or not, to encourage charging station deployment within the community. All right, so if we go to the next slide, this is the last best practice that I'll discuss today, and this one related to EVs, and this one is related to just kind of making EV readiness requirements in your zoning ordinance in general. So when we have EV ready requirements, at a minimum, it ensures that parking areas can be built with some of the necessary electrical infrastructure to accommodate EV charging. We, when we install that like conduit and raceways needed for charging infrastructure, for charging stations, and increase the electrical capacity during that initial construction, it is typically far less expensive and disruptive than having to go back later and add in that infrastructure. Having these requirements also establishes clear expectations for our developers and help ensure that charging infrastructure will be available for our community members, especially in areas like multifamily housing, where um, it's harder for those residents to have access to charging as compared to single family homes. So EV ready ordinances aren't a one size fits all and can and should be tailored to your current and anticipated market readiness and the needs and the desires of your community. We also recommend that the requirement should not favor a specific charging technology, but instead focus on infrastructure needs that can support various EV charging options. And once again, just being mindful of what your specific state context is, we would recommend that you review your state building code or other legislation to ensure that those codes or legislation doesn't preempt any local EV requirements that your community might make. All right, so if we go to the next slide, there's a lot of information that I just went over now, and I didn't have time to talk about, what communities are doing that or what resources exist related to updating your zoning ordinance. So I would recommend reaching out to us about the Charging Smart program, which is one way that you can get free technical assistance and more support on these topics. So with that, I will move on to the last topic that our cohort covered, which was geothermal systems. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see that for the other technologies that we covered, like EVs and solar and BESS, they have established best practices for zoning and land use, whereas geothermal systems aren't quite as widespread yet, especially on the residential side of things. And so the technology doesn't quite have that same robust national best practices to point to yet. So that is all just to say, if we go to the next slide, Zoe, that uh, kind of I'm calling these more considerations rather than best practices, just while we're still continuing to build our knowledge base for this technology. We also, as with anything, and as I've said a couple times already this presentation, but we recommend that you learn your specific state context before digging into this work, since there can be a lot of variability in the role that local governments can play based on what your state policy related to geothermal may be. I also want to give a thank you to Noah Cordoba from the Building Decarbonization Coalition, or BDC. BDC is a national advocacy group that's centered on decarbonizing buildings, as their name might suggest. And part of their work that they do focuses on geothermal systems, and they are a great resource related to this topic. And Noah was gracious enough to present on this topic at our cohort meeting. So some of what is being discussed today comes from that presentation. I do also want to highlight a guide that my colleagues at GPI, along with other valuable partners, have been working diligently on. And it's a guide to implementing geothermal in Minnesota, which will be published soon as a little sneak peek for you. And some of the information that we're talking about today also comes from that work. So I need to give credit where credit is due. If we move on to the next slide, right off the bat, I think it's helpful to provide a bit of context, what we mean when we're talking about geothermal systems in this context. We aren't talking about geothermal systems that drill miles into the earth and are used for generating electricity. We're talking about geothermal systems that are designed to heat and cool buildings. These systems sometimes are referred to as ground source heat pump systems, and they use very little electricity to transfer large amounts of thermal energy between the ground and buildings, and they're using that heat directly, as opposed to power generation that is sent elsewhere. There are some other pretty simplistic definitions on the slide just for some level setting that I won't go over, but I do want to draw your attention to thermal energy networks, which was a big focus of the cohort meeting. And thermal energy networks are also sometimes referred to as TENS, and they're systems that of thermal energy that's shared among buildings in a neighborhood or a larger scale, rather than kind of each individual building having its own ground source heat pump. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a graphic from the guide that I was just referring to earlier that GPI and other partners worked to create, and it just shows various closed loop system configurations. And in the middle of that graphic is an example of a thermal energy network with some individual ground source heat pump systems to either side. So now that we've done a little bit of level setting, provided some definitions, if we'll go to the next slide, we'll switch gears to discuss considerations for when you are addressing geothermal uh, systems within your ordinance. And as with solar, as with BESS, as with EVs, the first consideration is to clearly define the terms related to geothermal. As we said earlier, this can provide more clarity if you're looking to install, for developers looking to install geothermal within your community, um, as to what's allowed, what isn't, and also helps your staff internally as well for interpreting these different applications that might be coming in to install geothermal. So we want to be mindful once again that we aren't being overly specific or name specific solutions or technologies to help, future-proof our code and avoid needing to make changes as the technology adapts. So if we go to the next slide, oh, well, actually, you know what? Excuse me. I do want to mention on there that I did have a graphic from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, which is a metropolitan planning organization in Pennsylvania that has developed for municipalities in their area a model ordinance. And so there's some definitions that are listed there, and that can be a good resource for perhaps what could be included in your zoning ordinance, with some of these other topics we'll discuss. So now if we can go to the next slide, apologies about that. I want to touch on including language around maintenance of a geothermal system, and as well as kind of the process and requirements for if the system is abandoned or decommissioned. One of the many benefits of ground source heat pump systems is that the equipment has a long lifespan, but they still, as with anything, will need some maintenance. And so that is good to be sure to address that within the ordinance. When we're considering decommissioning and abandonment, they are essentially holes in the ground. And so some communities have taken the approach more akin to the decommissioning or abandonment of water wells when setting up process requirements. So that's one thing that you might want to look into if you're writing a zoning ordinance related to geothermal. If we go to the next slide, um, similar to solar ordinances, municipalities might want to address setbacks within their code and create requirements for different conditions. So if the system is going to be in near wetlands or stabilization ponds, you might want to make some considerations for that. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record, we want to make sure that our setback requirements aren't more stringent than other setback requirements that already exist in the code, and perhaps provide language that allows for some flexibility if upon review there's some reason that the site can't meet those requirements. Once again, I do have DVRPC's example setback requirements that they suggested for their communities, but of course, I would recommend that you consider your own specific conditions and do your own due diligence when it comes to setbacks within your municipality. So if we move to the last slide, or the last consideration, we do want to think about permitting requirements in your code, either in your code or separately, creating streamlined permitting and transparent processes so that your developers know clearly what the process is in your community. When we're thinking about the permitting process for geothermal, we tend to look towards gas infrastructure because as a place to start developing that process, because the installation processes and the labor that's being used are extremely similar. We're digging up the streets, we're trenching them, we're putting in pipes, and we're sealing the holes up. And so many different departments and agencies can be involved, which I have a slide coming up that gets into that a little bit more. But we do just want to make sure that we're creating a clear list of requirements for our permit applications. So that is just something to think about. And of course, I encourage you to know your state-specific context, and if there's anything that if you're developing something in terms of permitting that's in compliance with any preempting authorities. So if we go to the next slide, this is a graphic that was developed by BDC to illustrate the various agencies and departments and why they might need to get engaged within the permitting process for geothermal systems. Just for time, I won't be going into all of them, but I think I just want to highlight that there's a lot of different departments or agencies that could be engaged, and even a variety of different permit types that would need to be submitted for just one geothermal installation. And so I think that just to me underlies why making sure our permitting is clear and defined and laid out so that when we are looking to install these systems within our communities, the process can be as smooth as possible. So my last slide related to geothermal is just to encourage you to learn more about your state context, of which BDC has a really great legislative tracker that I would encourage you to look at, and I believe we'll be sending out as a part of this. But also, there's a federal credit that is available until 2035 to fund these projects. And if you're wanting to know more about, specific communities that have installed these systems, Rochester, Minnesota, and Framingham, Massachusetts have some great examples to look at. So with that, we'll go over to the next slide, which is a poll for you all. Oh, and I did notice that the state legislative tracker did just get put into the chat. But today we were talking about topics that were discussed within the zoning for achieving climate and affordability goals cohort that we hosted. And so we just really want to assess if there's interest among local governments in participating in future similar cohorts. As well as what topics might be of interest to community members. So a poll, a Zoom poll just popped up on your screen. If you could take a moment to fill that out, let us know, would you have interest? And whether you have interest or not, what are some topics that have been coming up for you recently that would be really beneficial to learn about in a sort of similar cohort setting. So we'll keep that slide up, or I mean this poll up for a moment to give you time to respond, but I do want to pass over the microphone back to Mackenzie to wrap us up here today.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I just want to thank everyone again for joining us. We're going to be looking through your responses to those polls, and we do have everyone's email, so we'll reach out if we do have another cohort opportunity. Zoe, could you take us to the next slide? Hopefully that won't take the poll down. Great. So just to recap, today we talked through some of the key takeaways from the cohort that we ran on energy affordability through using zoning as a tool. And we have 2 webinars coming up in this series that we hope you'll also join us for. The next one is going to be this coming Wednesday at the same time, so July 22nd at 12 p.m. Central. And it's going to focus on autonomous vehicles. We'll be looking at levers that local governments can use to protect or advance their climate goals while considering that new mobility option, and sharing a playbook that we will be launching at the webinar. The Following Wednesday on July 29th, again at 12 p.m. Central, we'll have another webinar on data centers in which we'll share a similar playbook, helping you step through these considerations. If you'll take us to the next slide, please, Zoe. Here is a QR code that you can scan to get you to a blog that we have about our webinar series, which includes the links to sign up for each of those sessions. And we'll eventually include the links to recordings from this webinar and the subsequent two webinars and links to the playbooks that we created through this project. So if you want to follow along, I encourage you to bookmark that page and return to it as we post more and more resources. That is all that we have for you today. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. We will post this recording and encourage you to reach out to anyone that you saw speaking here today with any questions that you might have about the subjects that you saw covered or any other climate-related technology that you're considering addressing through your zoning or other planning initiatives. We have experts on staff that are ready and willing to help however we can.